she's a mess head too, just like Jeff. She's mad at me because I fired her and don't let her work for me anymore. She's mad. So they're not going to say anything good about me.
No, he fired me, I think, just because I gave up my phone and wasn't staying quiet.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We haven't completed our deep dive of the first interview from May 13th. And so this is essentially the first of 13 deep dives in terms of Barry's interviews. On May 13th, 2020, CBI agent Joseph Cahill and Detective Robin Burgess interviewed Barry. And bear in mind, the very next day they interviewed Morgan Gentile and Jeff Puckett, and only to re-interview Morgan Gentile again. I think they ultimately interviewed her 5 separate times. And the police had fairly simple questions to ask. They wanted to know Barry's background in terms of his marriage to Suzanne. And obviously this was dealing with the statistics that in this kind of situation, often it is the partner closest to the victim that is the perpetrator in something like 80% of cases. And so it was only normal to be asking these sorts of questions. What were their living arrangements? And what was going on with their daughters? And just what was the dynamic within the marriage? Barry explained that they resided in Arcadia, Indiana until approximately 2018. At that time, he sold his landscaping business, BLM Landscaping, and other real properties and moved to the residence at 19057 Puma Path, Salida. Barry, an avid hunter and outdoorsman, explained they moved to Salida to be closer to one of their daughters who attends Western State University in Gunnison, Colorado. I think that's a little bit of a distortion because it's not as though their daughter was already at university. What I mean is she wasn't at university and then they moved. She could have really studied at any university. And I mean, isn't the point of studying at a university not at home, to not be where your parents are? And look where the Morphew girls were on Mother's Day, certainly not with their parents. Barry stated that he, Suzanne, and his daughters reside at 19057 Puma Path. There are no other persons who live at this address. Barry stated he has a family Verizon cellular phone account for his blank, Suzanne's blank, along with blank and blank phones. Barry has an iPhone 5S. He did not know the model of Suzanne's Apple cell phone, but knew it was pink in color. That you might think that is not really a big deal. So what, Barry had an iPhone, Suzanne had also an Apple cell phone. Well, what we're dealing with here potentially is the notion of an iCloud and whether someone had access to that iCloud and thus was able to spy effectively, or certainly try to spy effectively on the other person. Of course, that's one of the reasons why Suzanne used LinkedIn to correspond with Jeff Libler. Now, what's quite interesting in this interview is Barry provides his own account of, for example, some of his work history, and we're going to deal with that in a moment. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I will be doing, as I say, a series of 13. This is the first in a series of 13 deep dives into Barry Morphew, into what he said to law enforcement. And that's really where you want to take out your notebooks and make notes and cross-reference what he says here and see whether his story evolves, see whether there are inconsistencies. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So Barry said he is the owner of Sunset Farms, a limited liability company, a landscaping company in Salida. Additionally, he works as a subcontractor for Deesland Structures Inc., DSI, right? That is the same company that Morgan Gentile worked for and was fired from. And that's possibly how those two encountered one another. DSI is a general contracting company in Salida. Was it DSI that contracted Barry to work on that retaining wall in Broomfield? Question. Barry stated he has several contracted employees. His primary contractor is Morgan Gentile. Barry stated that Morgan previously worked with him at DSI until she was fired about a year ago. When she was terminated, he hired her on as a contractor. Barry stated he is also a volunteer firefighter with the Chaffee County Fire District. He is assigned to the Maysville Station 5. Barry stated Suzanne is technically unemployed. However, she would complete the invoicing for Sunset Farms. Now, you may remember Barry only got $189,000 for his business when he sold his business in Arcadia, Indiana, and presumably would need some of that money to buy equipment and to invest in his new business in Colorado. If you think about it, $189,000 isn't a heck of a lot of money if you're going somewhere else and you haven't been able to sell your house in Indiana. Meanwhile, you want to buy an enormous house at Puma Path and set up a brand new business. Bear in mind, Barry probably left most of his equipment behind in Indiana, especially when he sold his business. And so, as you know, they bought an enormous house for over $1 million and probably still had a huge mortgage 2 years later. So the question is, how much of that $189,000 that was really Barry's money went into the house? How much went into the business? It's also interesting that Barry seems to hire illegals, as someone put it. Now, although he says he had contracted workers, I would be interested to see those contracts. He hires Morgan Gentile. When you look again, he's fired her. He's hired Jeff Puckett. And when you look again, I think he says in the audio that he was fired as well. A childhood friend of Barry, Kurt Sigler, is recorded on page 52 of the affidavit saying Barry burnt many bridges in Indiana in terms of his work relationships. And it feels to some extent like he was doing the same here in Colorado and specifically on this job. After speaking with Kurt on audio recording, Agent Kobach walked out the parking lot with him. Kurt turned and said, "I think he killed her." Kurt's father stated that Barry's timeline doesn't make sense. The bike was thrown down the embankment. The stuff found along the road was placed and it was like thrown when Barry was driving back. That's words from the affidavit. Curtis also said if anyone found out about Barry's infidelity, they would all turn on him. Barry also burnt many bridges in Indiana, referring to business deals. And so, yeah, you seeing someone else making an allegation about Barry's infidelity. Now, that is certainly an area where we still don't have any absolute proof, where we have a certain amount of uncertainty. Anyway, let's get back to Barry's statement. Barry stated he owns a black 2013 Ford F-350, one gray 2015 Ford 250, and then one white 2015 Range Rover, Suzanne's vehicle, and one white 2007 Ranger Rover vehicle. That's quite important as well. So there's a black Ford 350 and then a gray Ford 250 and then two other vehicles as well. Presumably one of those is also at the being used by one of the daughters. Barry said that Suzanne frequently uses Snapchat to communicate with her friends and daughters. Barry stated that Suzanne also uses Instagram and Facebook. He clearly didn't know about the LinkedIn or the WhatsApp, or if he did, he wasn't letting on. Going to page 19, Barry's two email accounts are blank and blank. Barry stated that Suzanne typically wakes up and has coffee. She reads her Bible and emails. She then rides a mountain bike around their neighborhood and then does other things around the house. Well, what have we learned so far in this case that differs from that? Well, she doesn't ride around their neighborhood. Also, she doesn't ride around in the morning. These are subtle differences to Barry's statement. On occasion, Suzanne rode the Methodist Trails area. That's true. Barry further explained that on Sunday she virtually attended their church, Salida Grace. The service is broadcast on YouTube and generally lasts about 1 hour. Now, what's interesting here isn't what Barry says, but what he doesn't say, right? He doesn't mention that it was Sheila's daughter's wedding on Sunday. So if she's going to run away from home, you would expect it wouldn't have been on that day. And Suzanne was apparently excited to watch that wedding via an online stream. And remember, this is all during COVID on May 10th. Now Barry talks about his working habits. He says he typically works until about 5 or 6 p.m. and returns home. They have dinner and he usually goes to bed around 9 p.m. Barry stated they typically sleep in the same bed. However, if he's snoring, he will sleep in the bonus room on the couch. There's a little bit of a Chris Watts thing going on here as well. Someone sleeping on the couch. The other thing that he doesn't talk about is how often he goes to gym and how often that is part of his typical day. Barry stated that Suzanne communicates daily via Snapchat with her best friend Sheila Oliver. Barry said they also communicate via text message. Barry stated that Suzanne also communicates daily with someone who is typically home at the house, especially with the current school cancellation due to COVID-19. I think that's also a reference to one of their daughters. Barry stated that blank, blank, and blank, best friend of blank, departed on or about May 5th or 6th for a road trip to Utah and Idaho. They were due back May 10, 2020. Now, I think if you're thinking of this as a premeditated crime, if they were due back May 10th, and the question is, I don't think it would have been in the morning of May 10th, probably, in the afternoon. But how could you really realistically commit the crime on May 10th? Wouldn't it be safer to commit it not on May 10th, a day before that? Barry explained that in 2019 his company had been contracted to build a retaining wall at a site in Broomfield, Colorado. That does seem like DSI had asked him to do it. Two of his contracted, Cassidy Cordova and Cody Cox, were tasked with the work. Barry said that the wall was not completed correctly and he lost $30,000 because of it. There's already an indication that things aren't going very well with his business. Barry could not recall the name of the general contractor for the job. That's also quite interesting. He can't remember the person who actually asked him, because that's the person who would say, yes, we needed it done urgently. The other thing that's quite interesting is the contractors that are initially mentioned, certainly in the affidavit, the people who were actually on site weren't either of these contractors that were mentioned. Anyway, in the next paragraph, Barry stated that on Saturday, May 9th, 2020, he worked with Morgan Gentile on a job site in Salida. Now, if my memory serves, Barry saw Morgan on the Friday, according to this, what he's just said here, on the Saturday, and he was supposed to pick her up at 5:30 p.m. on Sunday as well. That's 3 days in a row, and that's over a weekend, and that's over a Mother's Day weekend. The task was to complete a rock beach on the property. After this job, Barry communicated with Suzanne by text message. They talked about hiking, and she later requested him to purchase hot tub chemicals. That's also quite interesting. Did Suzanne, in the middle of this second chance at life and being done and being as upset as she was about what was going on, did she really want to be in the hot tub with Barry, right? And was she thinking about that? Conversely, was Barry thinking about being in the hot tub with somebody else? Barry stated his last message from Suzanne was between 11 a.m. and noon. That's quite a broad sort of length of time. Anyway, Barry stated at around 2:26 p.m., he texted Suzanne that he was done and headed home, and this was on Saturday. Barry stated that sometime on Saturday, Suzanne asked him to take her mountain bike and helmet out of her vehicle, which he did. I must say that is actually incredible as well, that Barry is saying that he was handling her bike and helmet, which I think is a potential plausible deniability for if his DNA, if there's any trace of him, fingerprints or DNA on her bike and helmet. And of course, even if he didn't say that, he could argue, well, he lived with her, and so sometimes, he could touch some of her possessions and it wouldn't be a big deal. So, as I say, it is interesting that Barry admits meeting Morgan Gentle on Saturday, and if he hadn't been called away on Sunday, wouldn't he likely have met her again and even spent the night in the same hotel? Because Jeff Puckett was only requested to join them almost as an afterthought, certainly according to Morgan. Going back to the affidavit, Barry stated that he was at the job site at 10 o'clock-ish. It was just a hotel and job back and forth. Barry stated that he drove to a McDonald's near the job site and cleaned his windshield. He then went back to the hotel room. He stayed in the room for about 1 hour and possibly watched television. Barry then returned to the job site. So Barry's saying that, it's an important job, it's a big job. He gets up early and then he goes and cleans his windshield at a McDonald's and watches television in his room. And then he also seems to be saying that he was at the job site for quite a long time. Barry stated in response to the question if he ate that day, which I think is an excellent question, he says, I kind of looked for something to eat, he said. He said that he always keeps granola bars in his truck. And he said, I saw a McDonald's pulled in there, but I don't like crap food, so I thought I'm not going to eat there. So he kind of has himself going to McDonald's and then I guess not eating at McDonald's, but instead eats a granola bar at McDonald's. And I guess that's also makes provision for, well, I ate a granola bar and then I threw it in the trash, right? That might be what he's suggesting there. And so he says, so I just ended up eating granola bars. Now, it's possible that that is what he did. I must say, I've always thought that he may have eaten in the hotel. While on the job site, Barry explained that his neighbor, Jean Ritter, called him and explained that X could still not reach Suzanne, and I presume that's one of his daughters. Jean, who has the access code for the house, asked to check the house and discovered that Suzanne's car was there, but her mountain bike was not. Barry stated he had texted Suzanne Happy Mother's Day earlier, and as did their daughters. And the important thing there is to know, when did that happen? Was it in the morning? Barry stated his daughters had not received any replies from Suzanne. Also, Barry stated there's no cellular phone service at the house unless the phone is on the Usenet Wi-Fi internet service. That's also something that is quite interesting. There obviously is some cellular activity, which is how they were able to monitor some of Barry's movements. And this spottiness of the service may also explain why the defense was saying it's impossible that Barry could have moved through walls. Well, it's because of this inconsistent signal. Anyway, Barry stated, I was at the job site when Jean called me, adding that Jean called at around 5 p.m. That's actually doesn't seem to be true based on the cell phone data that we've looked at so far. So that Barry was actually at the hotel when Jean called him. So it's interesting that he seems to not be truthful on this particular point. Barry left the job site and drove to the hotel where he dropped the tools off in the lobby. That's true, but that is not the time that he did that. He then drove directly back to Salida. Barry initially said there were no issues with their marriage. Later in the interview, when asked, Barry disclosed they did fight. So even in this first interview, he first portrays the marriage as perfectly fine. But then when he's pressed, he does concede that they were arguing. Barry explained that Suzanne has battled through stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma several times in her life. The most recent battle started late last year, 2019. Late last year. So you can see how the cancer is creating a situation of increased separation between the two, and also that it's recent. It's late in 2019, and bear in mind Suzanne disappears in the sort of early part of 2020. Suzanne was receiving maintenance treatments at the cancer center in Salida. And now to wrap up, at the bottom of page 20 of the 129-page affidavit, Barry stated that Suzanne started using blank. I don't know if that's antidepressants or a specific drug and alcohol. Barry stated this drug and alcohol use would sometimes lead to arguments during which Suzanne would accuse him of being controlling. So it's actually quite interesting that Barry concedes that Suzanne is calling him controlling in the very first interview. And so it is a very important thing to establish. Is he controlling? And this is something that is repeated by quite a few people. And then also, how controlling is he? And bear in mind, Barry would apparently even say to Morgan Gentile that I don't think he wanted her to give them her phone. That was the one thing. He didn't want her to talk to the police, according to her. And so, is that controlling of an employee? Barry described Suzanne's demeanor as hateful. Barry stated that the last argument they had was Friday morning. He denied any physical harm to her or altercations between Suzanne and him. Now, throughout his interviews, Barry moved from referring to a perfect marriage and a perfect Friday night to admitting he fought with Suzanne often. That's quite an interesting inconsistency within the first interview. Barry said their daughters did not know about Suzanne's substance use and demanded that information not be disclosed to them. In fact, when asked, Barry admitted he deleted text messages from his cell phone because he did not want their daughters to access his phone and read those messages. So you have a very interesting premise here for Barry doing certain things that seem suspicious, but then he says he's doing it ostensibly for the right reason. And think about the psychology of Barry seems to be doing something suspicious. He goes to work on Mother's Day, but actually no, he's doing it for the right reason. He's working, right? Ostensibly. Interestingly, some of the footnotes, including 27 and 28, quite interesting to look at. All of the statements in this paragraph are later proven false, according to the affidavit. On April 22, 2021, FBI agents showed, this is like a year later, showed Barry surveillance photos of him being in his hotel room, not the job site, when Gene Ritter called him at 5 p.m. Now, it's not 100% clear what that reference is to. The whole paragraph is, what does it say? All the statements in this paragraph are later proven false, and it's paragraph 27. But it seems to be a reference to what he's talking about when he's at McDonald's, where he says he wanted to clean his windscreen, he wanted to eat granola bars, and that's what he ended up doing at McDonald's. It's that part of his narrative that they seem to be disputing. Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be continuing with the other aspect from Morgan Gentile, and then continuing through the remaining 12 deep dives in this series. I hope you'll join me in going through them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.